Today, people are celebrating what they call Labor Day without the slightest idea of why it is they're celebrating. Folk just see it as a day off, as an excuse to light up the charcoals, so to speak, to bust up a 40 ounce, to sort of get down. And it's another example of how we, as African people, find ourselves trapped in situations that we don't understand anything about, and sometimes are celebrating that which actually works against our interests as a people. I just want to say that Labor Day is supposed to be something, a holiday that celebrates labor, the value of labor, laborers, of workers. And I don't know the specific story about why this day was chosen and who the laborers are who came to epitomize the holiday that's supposedly celebrated on today. But I do know this, that those laborers were not the ones whose labor created the economy that benefits white people, the whole imperialist world, at the expense of African folk. And the truth is that labor nowhere in this country or any place else in the world will ever be fully appreciated, can never be appreciated, cannot be depreciated, because labor, all human labor, has been diminished by slavery, by the capture of African people, and by thrusting us as a whole people into slavery. It's impossible to talk about valuing labor, celebrating and appreciating labor, without talking about reparations for all of that stolen labor that created the wealth that white people and people who benefit from imperialism experience all around the world. See what I'm saying? Because you can't talk about, how can anybody talk about they value labor or value laborers when you've got a situation where you live in a world that was created, the whole world economy that benefits anybody. If there's an economy in the world that's beneficial to anybody on earth, it is an economy that was built with stolen labor, and most instances on stolen land. So until that is recognized, until it is recognized that all the value that we talk about, we're looking at in America, has its origin in the stolen labor of black people, of African people, until that is recognized, then this discussion about the appreciation of labor is phony, and all of us need to say it's a phony discussion. And in fact, if that's not what you're talking about, if you're not celebrating the stolen labor of African people, and how do you celebrate that? You celebrate that labor with what? Reparations, don't you? You give reparation. You say, we finally come to our senses. We now understand the value of labor, and we are going to celebrate this recognition by paying reparations to all of those African people from whom we've stolen this value. That's what has to happen. Now, some people don't get it. And even white people who say that they work for the benefit of labor, of workers, don't get it. Some of these same white people will say that they are opposed to reparations. They will say that I'm opposed to reparations, because they say this reparation that you're talking about will have to be paid with my white taxpayers' dollars. And some of them will say we're opposed to reparations, because if you talk about paying reparations to African people, somehow you split, you divide, you create this artificial division between Africans and white people, between workers, between the so-called imaginary white working class. Some people argue that. In fact, the first person who reorganized the head up the African National Reparations Organization that the African People's Socialist Party founded in 1982 had to be fired, because immediately after the conference that founded the meeting, she met with some white left groups, and the white leftists convinced her that the demand for reparations would split the so-called imaginary working class. And so she couldn't even hold up the demand for reparations. So I just want to say a few things about that. And I want you to hear what I said. Even white workers and their representatives will find themselves opposed to reparations. And they will do that in the name of labor, in the name of united workers, they will say. That somehow, here you are, with all the value of your labor, of your parents and grandparents, great-grandparents' labor being stolen to create the value that they experience, to make it possible for white workers to live in homes where sometimes they have two-car garages with a station wagon attached, with a boat attached to it, parked right here in a little rinky-dink city like St. Petersburg, right? These workers will find somehow that you are struggling to divide them when you try to get payment for labor that has been stolen from the value of African folks. So I just want to say some things about it and how we come to this. The truth of the matter is that we're talking about human society, and people offer up all kinds of explanations for what is this motivating force in human society that drives human society. And we get all kinds of explanations for it, but the one that we get most times is we get it from the church, because that is where most of what passes as an explanation for reality that oppressed African people get. They get it from the church. They hear it from a lying, thieving, parasitic creature calls himself a preacher. And I'm sorry if that sounded subjective, but the objective reality is a preacher is a parasite. And a preacher is a parasite because he is someone, or she is someone, who does not produce anything and lives off those who do produce. And that's what's called a parasite anywhere in the world, that you need a host upon which you live. And that's what a preacher is. So it is not a subjective thing. It's not slander. I'm not talking bad about preacher, but it's just objectively what it is. He's somebody who lives off other forces of production. And so most of our explanations for reality, unfortunately, comes from the church. And they would tell us that the reason we are here on earth is to serve God. And God manifests, and it's always him, his white self, most of the time. I'm sorry, y'all upset, aren't you? You know damn well when you think of God, I know you think of a white man. I can describe him for you. He's got a beard, white beard at that, and he's got flowing, sometimes unruly white hair. And it's mostly unruly when he's upset. And this God is usually upset, isn't he? And the reason you know he's upset because you're catching hell all the time. And the explanation you get for catching hell all the time is that God is displeased with you, right? And so that's a God that's upset, right? If you got right with God, then all your problems would be solved, isn't that right? So that's what we hear most of the time. So we're told that we're here to serve God, and that is the basis for our being here. But the truth is that the motive, the driving force in all human society is, and that's redundant to say human and society in the same time. The motive of force in society is the production and reproduction of real life. That's the thing that keeps it going on. That's the thing that makes society happen. This process of production and reproduction of real life. What am I talking about? I'm talking about, first of all, I'm talking about reproducing ourselves as a species. I'm talking about this process of having babies, etc. I know when you put on this brother from the Isley brother and invited her to your crib, you weren't thinking about the production and reproduction of real life, but that is in fact the motive force. That was the thing that made you think about it. That was why you had her to come over, you got him to let you come over, or you brought him over. It is because of this need, this urge, this driving force to recreate ourselves as human beings, as people. So that's one thing, because if you don't have no people, you ain't got nothing else, do you? If you don't have no people, you ain't got Reverend Chicken Bone, you ain't got no politics, you ain't got nothing. So part of the driving force, the fundamental thing about the driving force in society is the production and reproduction, the creation and recreation of life, of real life itself. So that is one of the things that we're talking about. The other things when we talk about the production and reproduction of real life, we're talking about the actual process of producing what we need to survive: food, clothing, and shelter. And this is an ongoing process that as we move through society, it gets better all the time. Our capacity to produce real life gets better all the time. We move from a place in history, a time and place in history where our ability to do this was extraordinarily uncertain, where we might have had to travel to follow the seasons to make sure that there was something to eat, because we hadn't mastered such things as growing our food. We had to rely on the success of hunters who went out to try and capture an antelope or something else like that to eat, because we had not yet domesticated animals and things like that. So at one juncture, it was a whole risky process, depending on bows and arrows and axes and rocks and sticks for successes. And then, of course, this whole process of the struggle to produce and reproduce real life, we got better at it. And we began to learn some things. We learned how to grow the food in a single place, so it wasn't necessary for us to follow the season. We didn't have to wait for an accident. We didn't have to wait for lightning to strike a tree so that we can get a piece of fire. We learned how to make the fire ourselves. And it got so better that ultimately the question of fire is something that we can now, we've taken the atom and what have you, and we can get all kinds of energy from that. And we've learned all kinds of things. So you see this process, the reason we moved from that juncture where we would go out on an uncertain quest to kill a bear or to kill an antelope to try to get something to eat, to now where there are stores that you can go to with this exchange value that we call money, and pick up a piece of bear if you want it, or a piece of cow, or pick up oats and what have you. We've moved to this place not because through some magical processes some people would suggest, but the ongoing struggle to produce and reproduce real life thrust us in this place where the process of development becomes much, much better. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's this need that we have. It's this drive in society that we bring to society to create and recreate real life that puts us here. Y'all with me? Now, in this process, this struggle, this is how we make history. We make history doing this. This is our culture. Culture flows from this process. The songs we sing and we learn and what have you are songs that we learn at some juncture that praises the sun that provided the energy that helped to grow the food, and the water, the rain that grew the food, and we learn dances and ceremonies and things like this. This is how culture evolves. And our effectiveness at this process of producing and reproducing real life, our effectiveness at this then gives us the kind of time that we need. If we are very effective, if we are very efficient in the production and reproduction of real life, then we find ourselves with the time to do other kinds of things, so that we're not spending all our time. Well, some of us spend a lot of time reproducing real life in some fashions, but in fact, that's one of our problems now. But the fact is that we are not in this desperate situation where we are constantly with our backs up against the wall trying to eke out of something to eat, trying to find shelter, etc. If we are efficient at this, then what we find ourselves with is with time to do other kinds of things. We become singers. We become poets. We find the leisure time for the development of these things that we might characterize as our humanity. And so you see from the earliest time on, you can go back and look and see those societies which were efficient in this whole process of creating and recreating real life, can't you? You can see them because there's been this evidence left of the arts that have been created that you can still find today, of the sculptures, of these gigantic, magnificent edifices that they have not been replicated anywhere else on earth. You see them, and then you still see the people who are many generations separate from that time when we were able to produce and reproduce real life for ourselves so effectively. Many generations separate who still know how to sing and dance and have this thing that people recognize as spirituality that we were able to capture because we were not at some critical juncture in our history placed in such desperate straits that all of our energies had to be used looking for food, clothing, and shelter. Y'all with me on that? That's why you who you are, Africans. That's why you're who you are. That's why you're not killers and people who are willing at the drop of a hat to annihilate entire cities and villages and countries and what have you to get some bread or to get some oil or to get some other kind of thing. Because in the development of our psyche, of who we were or who we are, in this process of developing, we were efficient at being able to produce those things that's necessary for our existence. We were born in the place on earth where all of those things came naturally. Look at the world and see where all the imperialists have their daggers pointed today. You see the wealth and the value. That's where we come from. And that's why even these outlanders, these forces now are targeting their guns and their bombs and their threats of destruction at those very places where we've come from, where life was so kind, where nature was so kind that it provided those things necessary for the production and reproduction of real life relatively easily. Ain't that something? Look at it. I'm telling you, you think I'm making it up. That's why you will see, look at Europe. Look at hostile Europe. Look at white people who left Europe running like animals, didn't they? I mean, they went every damn where. They're in Canada, they're in Australia, they're in New Zealand, they're in Africa, they're in Latin America. They're every damn where getting the hell out of Europe because Europe was hostile to life. And it was hard to produce and reproduce real life there. And they went to those places where life was easily produced and reproduced. And then they went there and they captured resources and they killed people and they kept their lily white asses there as long as they could stay there. Had to be removed from some of these places at gunpoint, didn't they? People still fighting them to get the hell out of here and go back where you came from. Isn't that true? And they don't want to go. Why don't they want to go? Because they've moved to a place where the production and reproduction of real life is simple, is easy. And that's where all human beings want to be. Isn't that right? So, we talk about this thing about labor. And here is one of the traps that some of our friends have. These are our white leftists or communists or Marxist friends because they do understand some things about labor. You see, all value is created by human labor. It's not created by doctors, professors, economists, presidents, or lawyers, or any of those things. It's human beings. It's labor that creates value. Nothing has value until a human hand has been placed on it and transformed it and made it into something that it wasn't before. Trees don't have value until human hands touch it. Human hands touch trees. And they turn trees into tables, and they turn trees into houses, and they turn trees into podiums, such as this one I'm standing here around right now. It's the human hand that touched it, that transformed it, that gave value to what used to be just a tree that was there. Y'all with me on that? Yeah. It's the same thing about gems that people like to wear around their necks. If somebody doesn't dig it out and do the work to bring it to you, it has no value. A gem has no value laying there in the ground. It's human hands. Bauxite. brought out of the ground, out of the mines, and worked with becomes aluminum. And where another worker is attaching it to a car that workers put together. You understand what I'm saying? This is the thing that gives it value. Had no value before human hands. In fact, production itself, all production is simply human hands being affecting nature. It is human beings, it's a human intervention in nature that is what we call production. And so our Marxist friends, our white, left, and liberal friends often recognize this thing about value, and therefore are able to talk about labor and its significance on the one hand, but on the other hand, even as they talk about this labor, are able to dismiss the significance of the African labor and the demand for reparations that we might make. And we say, well, how in the hell does that happen? Because the Marxists and our white liberals and friends come into the question late. They see the car once it gets to Detroit. They see the bauxite being worked on in Detroit that turns into aluminum. They see the tire that goes on to the car. They see all of the work that's done right there at what they call the point of production. But they didn't see the 10 million people who the Belgians killed in the Congo to get the rubber that got to Detroit. Do you understand what I just saw? They had to get some rubber from somewhere before they could attach it to that car. They didn't see the Africans who worked in the mines in places like Guyana or in places like Guinea in Africa, who brought that bauxite up out of the ground and made it available for folk to work with it in Detroit or some other place. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. That was invisible to them. They've left out this incredibly significant equation when they talked about the creation of value. And so we live in a world where people can talk about the value of labor and they can sing praises to labor and leave the African out. Because we are invisible in their consciousness. Even Marx, as he talked about the significance of labor, and it was Marx who among whites perhaps did a better job than anybody in talking about the value of labor. Even Marx, when he talked about the emergence of an economy based on the selling of commodities, based on the expropriation of stolen value, even Marx ran into this non sequitur where he could say out of his mouth, on the one hand, that what he characterized as the wage slavery in Europe, which meant the capitalist relations, which they talked about wage slavery, and that's really a misappropriation of language, because wage slavery is what they were talking about white people were doing, working in the factories and stuff. He said wage slavery in Europe required as a pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World. Ours was the slavery pure and simple. Yet Marx, even having come to this understanding, could not say, therefore, in order to end capitalism or wage slavery in Europe or any place, what we have to do is kick the pedestal out from under it, and that pedestal is slavery pure and simple. Even Marx came up with this non sequitur saying that therefore, in order to overturn capitalism, which is wage slavery, we have to somehow give power to the white workers, all of whom exist with the white bourgeoisie on this pedestal of slavery pure and simple. Y'all with me? I know it's complicated. You see what I'm saying? So we invisible. But let me tell you this. Let me tell you this. The working class, this force that we now talk about when we talk about labor, is a relatively new phenomenon in Europe. Was no working class. It was white people living in Europe, but they were not what we characterize as workers. They were peasants. They were people, the majority of whom tied to the land, like what they call sharecroppers when they were doing it to us here in the South, where they would work and most of their labor went to the landlord, who got most of what they produced, and they kept a part of it, and they were tied to the land like slaves, to the extent that if the landlord sold the land, the worker, the peasant, went with the land, got a new landlord. They were taxed. They had all kinds of difficulties. But there was no such thing as a working class. What was it that gave rise to the working class? The working class, this thing that created a situation that emancipated white people from serfdom, that took them away from the people who Robin Hood was helping them with. Y'all remember the story of Robin Hood stealing from the rich and giving to the poor? The thing that did what Robin Hood couldn't do, elevated poor white folks, you understand, from their status as peasants, and then made them workers who now were getting a different amount of value for their labor power. Couldn't be sold. Couldn't be handled in the way they could be handled before. What was it that did that? The thing that did it was slavery. It was slavery. It was stolen resources that also was coming from places like Vietnam and China that was being stolen. All these resources now coming, transforming Europe. So now you see the emergence in Europe and in North America of this thing they call industrial revolution, where now these people who were just peasants the white power needs to get their asses off the land. They create these things called the Enclosure Acts in England and other places to kick these peasants off the land. Get your ass out of here. Why did they want them off the land? Because as long as they were on the land, as bad as things were for them, they had food to eat. They can grow their own collard greens and what have you. They needed a destitute white person. Why did they need a destitute white person? They needed a white person who had to sell his labor power in order to live, to exist. Y'all with me on this? And nobody going to work in no damn factory where they might lose their life, their arms, their eyesight, their et cetera, if they got another way to feed themselves. So the Enclosure Acts, I missed y'all, didn't I? I left y'all somewhere, didn't I? So they kicked them off. And then you see this incredible development of industry happening in Europe. Gold coming there, silver coming there, ivory coming there. Guess what? They needed ivory to make billiard balls, you know, to shoot pool with, and piano keys, etc., and kill damn near every elephant in Africa. And damn near every African who they had going to get the elephants and the ivory for it. And so you saw suddenly in Europe, white people who were stuck on the land now needed to make ships, now needed to smelt iron for chains and for nails and other kinds of stuff, and to make sails and to grow and to fix clothing and to store food. A whole working class now begins to emerge to facilitate the process of sending ship after ship out to capture African people. Y'all with me on that? And so you begin to see here the emergence of a working class. You begin to see now the need, you move away from this need where you have a single little hat maker or shoemaker being enough to meet the requirements of the neighborhood. Need a whole bunch of shoes at the same time. So you need shoes for all the people who are going to be sailors. You need clothing for them. You need chains for the slaves. You need new ships, etc. You got now the emergence of a working class. And guess what? With this emergence, the working class is now better off. White people are better off than they were before. And it gets even better. The more they steal from around the world, the better off things are for them. They got better houses. They can go to school. They don't have to listen to the nobility anymore. They can move when they want to move, live where they want to live. They can even live cold, state, foggy, rainy England and go to somebody else's country. They have been emancipated, finally. But they have been emancipated at the expense of Africans and other people. Now the European workers is in a situation where indeed he can produce and reproduce real life for himself. Can he do it? But the African now has been transformed and cannot produce and reproduce real life for himself. Doesn't mean that he and she are not producing real life. It just means it's not for ourselves. We are now producing and reproducing real life for Europe, for white people in North America and the rest of y'all with me on that? So we want the value of that labor to come back to us. That's why you look in Africa. You look here. The lifespan of African people is something like, on average, of the African man is 9 years less than the African white man. We're not producing and reproducing real life when you have that kind of situation. And in Africa, it's even worse. You see? You see what I'm saying? And so we need to jumpstart this process to demand a real appreciation for labor, and you do that with reparations. Pay us for the value of our stolen labor. Is that the salvation for African people is in Africa. That there is no solution for us outside of the liberation of Africa. And people, I don't care how difficult and that might sound and how uncompromising the statement may seem to be, but it's true. And it shouldn't be, but I know it's a difficult thing for some people to even deal with, that this notion that that our freedom is tied to Africa. That there is no solution other than that. And we can continue to talk about that, but it shouldn't be something that bothers us. Because the truth is that if you can believe anything that I said, the reason white people came to Africa is because Africa was bountiful and where they were was not. That's why they went every place else. They were looking for booty. And they were looking for, I almost said, because they didn't have booty. And that was true in both the ways that we understand it in the community and the way they understand it. But that is the truth. Our problem is that Africa has been robbed viciously, brutalized viciously. And an example and evidence of the brutality done to Africa is our presence in this country, worried about the prospect of having to go to Africa. Isn't that something? You got Negroes who you talk about, you got to go back to Africa. And that's a statement of the attack that was made on Africa. Africa was attacked. And Africa has all the answers, all the solutions. If it didn't have the answers and the solutions, white people wouldn't have gone there to get the answers and solutions. And they've kept it for themselves. So I just feel like it's really important to say that. That's the direction that we're pointing. That's the direction that the spear is pointed. That's where our future lies. That's where our history lies. That's where our future lies. I interviewed, did anybody hear the show this morning? Interviewed this brother, Tommy Platje, who is the Secretary General of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. You call it South Africa. And he spoke at one of our meetings in London a couple of weeks ago. He talked about the significance of the land to African people. And he says that among the cultures, when a child is born, that the umbilical cord is planted in the yard, and a tree is planted over the umbilical cord. It is a firm attachment to the land. And that if a person goes away and that tree seems to have a problem under which that umbilical cord is planted, then they make the assumption that something is wrong with this person, wherever that person may be in the world. I mean, the connection to the land. We are rootless. We have no connection. And the truth of it is, as much as we say that we are attached to America, what we really attach to is Coca-Colas and Big Macs and CDs and what have you. It's not America, because white people don't allow us to stay one place in America long enough to get attached to it. You go back and look at the place where you grew up. And the truth of the matter is that white people have moved you 4 or 5 times since the last time you were there. That community has been wiped out. Now they moved you over to another community. We are rootless. And Africa is ours. And so this is a false attachment. It's like sugar, something you can get addicted to that's no damn good for you. You want it all the time, but it's killing you even as you do it. And the more you use, the worse off you are. That's why all these Africans, in part, suffering from things like diabetes, etc. And that's what Americanism, this false attachment to a country that's done nothing but brutalize us, kills us. It kills us daily. Let's think about it. I speak all the time talking about the average lifespan of Africans versus white people, and I've used I think 6 years or 7 years. I'm looking at something that since the 90s, it's been at least 9 years difference between the lifespan of an average white man and an average African man. 9 damn years. America is killing us. And we hanging on, fighting tooth and nail to stay in this horrible place. There's nothing but, if there's a hell, and I believe there is a hell, this is it. And then we just don't have enough damn sense to see it. America is killing us, and we're going to have to fight our way out of this and then let white folks learn to deal with themselves. You see, Uhuru.
Before we move on, does anyone have any questions?
This is what Africans need to understand. The value of your labor does not disappear. Even if it were not true that the rate of exploitation of Africans has been greater since slavery, the value of the labor done during slavery has not disappeared. Value doesn't disappear. It is now value that is concentrated in all of the things that you see around you, even in the computers and what have you. The value doesn't go away. What happens to that value? It doesn't disappear. It continues to exist, and it is concentrated in value that follows from it. And that's a really important thing for us to understand, because people like to say, well, that happened a long time ago, even if they just talk about slavery. They say, well, you know, the ones who did it to you, they don't exist anymore, and the ones to whom it was done directly don't exist anymore, therefore it's over. But the reality is the value is still there. It is concentrated in all the value that you see around you. Value does not disappear. Mm-hmm. I just want to say a couple of things about that. First of all, I want to address the question of technology. It's really interesting, this whole issue of technology, because what's clear to me is that the barbarians have seized control of the technology. And technology is driven in this really reckless and dangerous and anti-human way. Technology is a relatively recent thing to white people. And I'm not slandering, I'm not race bashing. I hope you understand this. The reality is that when we were building pyramids and doing things like that, it was before white people had even mastered fire. So what has happened is that white people conquered the technology of others, conquered the technology of Africans and etc., and stole it. And the barbarians are now in control of technology. And look at the direction it goes in with the barbarians. Here you have a people who have not really achieved a certain level of civilization. It's like, think about it, if you could turn loose some apes or lesser beings in a room full of dangerous, high technological stuff. I mean, the barbarians have seized control of the technology, and it's a very dangerous situation. I use the term barbarian, and I didn't create that. I said barbarians. It's a term that comes straight out of Europe, where they used it themselves to describe the behavior and activity and state of existence of other Europeans. But the reality is that for the longest time in history, most of the world saw those Europeans coming from where they came from as being barbaric and uncivilized and really dangerous and treacherous kinds of people. Now, having said that they have the technology, the fact is that there has always, since our conquest, been an extraordinary technological gap between the oppressed and the oppressor. It existed between the Vietnamese and America. It was an incredible technological gap. The Vietnamese started fighting with sticks and what have you. And of course, they were able to be victorious. And the thing that helps us to understand our potential doesn't show us the way. There is no roadmap. We're going to have to find this ourselves in the process of struggling. We're not going to find it in the process of a debate or discussion, but the process of struggling is how we find solutions to these questions that we have. But you know how we know? We've seen the vulnerability with all this technology. Box cutters. Nobody, if you go with what they said, Bush was talking about nuclear shields, talking about things like Star Wars, etc., and what they said to us is somebody with a box cutter got on one of these huge technological behemoths that they don't possess in the land that they came from, right? And they used a box cutter and turned it against them. And what I'm suggesting is the technology that they have. You know what they've done? It's the thing that somebody said when we were in London. Perhaps Wally remembers this. Somebody raised this question. Somebody was always wanting to raise the question of armed struggle. And I'm trying to get away from it. I just want y'all to come to a meeting. I can't even get y'all to come to a damn meeting, right? And so the person was saying, well, we don't have. They got all these guns, etc., etc. How are we going to fight them? And the question is simple. You don't have a gun. You got a rock. You take a rock and hit the enemy with a gun, and then you take the gun and you got a rock and a gun, right? And then you take the gun you took from the enemy and shoot another enemy, and then you got two guns. And the shit works just like that. You understand? And so while it appears that they have this control over the technology, much of the technology is accessible to us. And this is it. Listen, why do you think that what they're saying to the people around the world, I'm glad you raised that. They don't want Iraqis. They don't want anybody to get this stuff that they call can be used for dual purpose. They don't want anybody to get any kind of technology. They trying to keep monopoly on all the technology in the world. Of course, this stuff is not a matter of dual capacity purpose. It's the fact that once people get computers, once people get this other stuff, they can begin to challenge their circumstances. And so the imperialists want to make sure that they can't even get a damn computer because they say you can use it for two things. You can also use it for something else. They want to make sure only their buddies, their friends got them. Well, hell, we got computers all around the joint. We got some upstairs there that haven't been used for ages, etc. And I'm saying that the technology is there. I met in Paris, France. These Africans, the minute I come to Paris, and I almost didn't get there, I met with these Africans, and they're part of an organization called A3D, and that's Africans for Action, there's another A, and something else for development. And they're from all over, they originate in different parts of Africa. And there were 15 of them at this meeting that they invited me to. And they came from all over Paris, and some flew in, from France. Some flew in, some came by trains and buses and cars, etc. And they said, and I met with these Africans, and these are African intellectuals, and they're doing all kinds of incredible works. They got this connection with forces where they've got doctors for Africa to intervene in any emergency place in Africa. They're using, and they're not just doing technology, but they're talking about technology based on the science of Africa, that comes from our own traditions and culture. They're just doing extraordinary works all over, and they wanted to have this connection with us. They said of us, this was an important meeting, they said, that we had to be here, and we had to meet with you. They said, because you clear the fog, you are the sun that clears away the fog. You bring hope for Africa. You understand? Here these people with all of this expertise and what have you, and they spread out all over Africa. And there's some of us who are trying to make this thing happen. I'm telling you that imperialism is in a desperate situation. How do I know? How do I know? I'm saying that right now what we are looking at, this whole thing that George Bush is trying to do to the world is a sign of the most desperate kind of crisis that the imperialists are confronted with. And they are confronted with losing every damn thing they have. Our responsibility is to help them lose it. You understand? And we are at that cliff. And the thing is that it's just a matter of us. You know what jiu-jitsu is? Does anybody know what jiu-jitsu is? And it's the art of jiu-jitsu is a martial art. that uses the strength and power of the opponent against him. You understand? So that's what September 11th was. If somebody else did it, it was a form of jujitsu. They didn't have the airplanes, and they didn't have the bombs, and they didn't have the missiles, but they had a goddamn box cutter. Yeah. According to the U.S., yeah. It was a form of jujitsu, and that's what we have to learn to do. We have to use the enemy's power against the enemy. And this technology is its weakness. It's its weakness. I used to be able, working on the newspaper, I could lay out, 10, 14 pages a day, as long as I was doing it with that glue and with that wax and stuff and laying it down. And then they put these damn computers on my ass, and I can't lay out nothing. But guess what? When the lights go out and the computers go down, I can lay out a newspaper, you understand? And that's the trap. The trap is when a monkey wrench goes into this stuff, it don't work. It doesn't work, you understand? And so I'm not that concerned. Let me tell you another example of technology used against them. In Vietnam, this is how white power is something, boy. They had created, and this is why the Vietnamese, I saw a documentary on television, and they were talking post-Vietnam with some Vietnamese officers in the military. And they said, in terms of the war they had with America, they said, America, you can't fight America from a distance. They say from a distance, America is powerful. Say it can shoot missiles and drop bombs from way up in the sky, etc., and they're powerful there. He said, but Americans are slow and clumsy. In order to fight them, you got to grab them by the belt. And that's the problem. We haven't had the guts to grab this sucker by the belt. And you fight his battle when you try to stand back here and fight with him because you can't handle him. But you grab this sucker by the belt and you can dance with him. This is what the Vietnamese did, talking about his technology. The Americans in California, they had a process with computerized delivery of bombs and stuff that they would use in Vietnam from a place in California. They would drop in Vietnam these sensors. You know how, and this is where things like when you walk to a supermarket and the door opens automatically. Well, this developed in the process of killing Vietnamese and other peoples around the world. They would drop these sensors in these places in Vietnam, right? And these were places where no human beings were supposed to be. So if the sensors picked up a human presence, then they'd push a button, and then they just shoot missiles right there. So what the Vietnamese learned to do is they start hanging up bags of piss all over different areas, right? And the sensors would pick up a human presence from the piss, right? And they'd push bombs, and they was blowing up piss all over Vietnam, right? And so that's using the technology against them, you understand? And Vietnam, there was a story that got told about they had to pass out flyers in places like what used to be called Saigon, occupied by the Americans. And you lose your life, you get caught doing this. So the Vietnamese, they would take flyers and they would wet them down and then sit them on top of high places, buildings, etc., while they were wet. And when the sun comes out, it dries. And as it dries, it just flutter all over the city. So the thing is that Huey is right. Huey was right when he said the will of the people is greater than the man's technology. And that's what we have to really understand, that you cannot be intimidated by his technology. We can kick his ass, you understand? His technology cannot extract a boot from up his butt. Let me tell you about technology. With all the technology they have, I'm still going through airports. Where Africans are the ones who are screening my bags, and other peoples are the ones who are screening my bags and deciding whether or not I got something in there that can hurt somebody. And at any given time, when struggle reaches a certain place, people begin to have to pick sides. And one of these days, people are going to go through there, and they're going to have something and not have something, because the airport persons are going to be sympathetic with the cause of free people. So with all the technology, their technology is built on a house of sand. It's built on a foundation of sand. And they got profound problems. They really got problems. And the issue that you mentioned about destruction is real too. I mean, now in Africa in particular, Zambia and Zimbabwe, there's a whole big issue. Because Africa is currently being used as a pawn in the struggle for genetically modified food. Africa, they starve Africa in a number of ways. I'm not going to try to get into the whole trade questions and stuff like that now. And there are about 14 million people, they say, are facing imminent starvation in Africa unless something is done. And what the U.S. is offering them is genetically modified food. In Zambia, Zimbabwe, and other places, Zimbabwe and Zambia has refused to take the food. And then, so this whole campaign of slander is being directed at them because in the face of all these starving people, they won't take the genetically modified food. Well, Europe won't allow genetically modified food either. And the U.S. is the one that's really pushing this thing because Europe won't do it because white people in Europe have resisted it. And there are a number of reasons to resist genetically modified food. They want to just say it that's just people who are struggling against scientific advancements and et cetera, but the truth of the matter is that the genetically modified food can actually destroy natural food crops if that stuff gets away, and it always gets out of the confines that they use it. So that you can end up with a plant that is supposed to, for example, they modify it so that it is resistant to disease, pesticides, and other kinds of things. And if that then escape, as it will, into other kinds of crops, I mean, without crops, you can have weeds that kill natural crops that can't die because they've been modified genetically. You can destroy out and this genetically modified food can become the super entity, the super plant that will move out all of the other naturally grown crops. And guess what? White power has a patent on all of the genetically modified food, so you can't even get no damn food, you understand, without going through them. And nobody knows what the consequences of consumption over periods of time with genetically modified food. So that's part of what you're talking about, the technology run amok, you know. You go and eat a piece of wheat that looks like George Bush. I mean, they're actually making really ridiculous cross-species kinds of modifications on various foods, etc. And that's another discussion for another time. I want to appreciate y'all coming out, and